So I am a field ecologist. I study trees, so you could also call me a forest ecologist. And my field site is in Costa Rica, in the tropics, in the tropical rainforest there. So when I have a particular question to study in the forest, I fly to Costa Rica, I get on an airplane. Sometimes I have students with me, my graduate students or field assistants with me, or sometimes my husband comes to do his research down there. We have a field site in a place called Monteverde, which is high in the mountains of Costa Rica. I'm really, really, really interested in what goes on in the treetops. Very few people have climbed trees up in the tropics for scientific purposes, but I wanted to be one of them. So I am one of them, and there are lots and lots of scientific questions to ask up there. So for 40 years, can you imagine 40 years of my life, 4 decades of my life, I have been climbing trees in Costa Rica. I use mountain climbing techniques. I shoot a line up with a slingshot. I pull up a climbing rope. I tie one end off. I get into just a standard climbing harness. And then I climb up the rope with these ascenders that take me up the rope. And when I'm sitting there on the branch, still tied into that rope, then I can start asking questions about forest canopies. And as it turns out, in a lot of tropical forests, wet forests, there are all kinds of plants that live up on the branches of these trees. Their roots don't go into the branches. They don't go down to the forest floor. They sit up there perched on these branches, and they get their food and their water from rainfall, from mist, and from dust that blows into the forest canopy. And these plants have adapted themselves to be able to meet all of their needs just by sitting up there on the branches. The fact that these maple trees and many other trees actually put out roots from their own branches and trunks that go underneath these mats of mosses. And I'll just dig into this a little bit, I don't want to wreck it up. This soil has been basically made by these mosses and these ferns. As they die and decompose, they create this soil. And so essentially it's a nutrient source, like fertilizer for your garden, but it's all here on these branches and trunks of trees way high above the forest floor. And some trees, like these big leaf maples, are actually capable of pushing out roots from their own trunks. And so nobody knew that before. Nobody knew that trees could put out roots into their own canopy and sort of suck nutrients out of their own tenants. And so when I published that, I think people realized that, oh my gosh, there's more in the canopy that's going on that we never knew about. And I have been so curious about these plants, like, what? How can you do that? And even more interestingly, what are those plants doing to the rest of the forest? How do those plants interact with the forest as a whole? It's like asking, well, how do you kids, how do you students interact with yourselves, but also how do you interact with the rest of society? How do you affect your parents and the people you encounter in the streets and people in restaurants and people that you're going to get a job with in the future? How do you fit in with the rest of society? And that's the same question I'm asking about these canopy plants. How do they fit in with the rest of the ecosystem? So one of the things, I'll just give you an example of one of our studies, which is at what time of year do these plants up in the canopy put out their flower and fruits? When do they bloom? When do they make their fruits that are available to birds and to monkeys and to insects to eat? And how might climate change be affecting the seasons and the timing of the flowering and the fruiting? If climate is changing, well, probably flowering and fruiting is too. So one of the things that we do is we climb up into the canopy of these study trees we have. We have marked plants that we put little tags on, and every time we go up there, once a month, we have a little notebook that says, okay, plant number 15, are you in flower and fruit? Plant number 16, are you in flower and fruit? Plant number 17, are you in flower and fruit? And we take these measurements every time we go up there. And so after 1 year, after 2 years, we have this record of the seasonality, the timing of these flowering and fruits. And when we get a very long data set, like 10 years, we'll be able to see whether or not there are changes in the timing of these flowering and fruiting plants. And that's just one tiny little piece of information about the tropical rainforest and how climate change might affect it. But you know what? That's how science works. Each scientist, him or her, is doing one little piece of asking really big, really important questions so that people like you can get the understanding of how climate change is affecting our planet. But a scientist only does one little piece of it. One scientist does the flowering, fruiting. somebody else might look at the ants or the beetles or the butterflies, and somebody else might do the soils, and somebody else might measure the climate. So all these scientists are kind of working together to understand what is going on with our planet. Well, over the 40 years, the 4 decades that I've been doing science, of climbing up into trees and of asking these small questions about canopy plants, how they survive, how they live, how they interact with the forest as a whole, I think what I've discovered and what my students and my colleagues and my associates have studied and understood is that even though the canopy is high above our heads and most people kind of ignore it, and even though the canopy plants make up just a small proportion of the forest as a whole, they have a very, very important role in terms of the whole system, because they collect nutrients from rainfall and hold on to them. They provide flowers and fruits for birds and for monkeys and for insects up in the canopy. They are, even though they're small, even though they're high above our heads, they are a really important part of this sort of the whole fabric of the forest. And I think, you know, for a scientist or for just a regular person, that's a really important thing to learn, that even though it's a small part of the whole, each part has a really important, very specific role that it plays. So even if you're one kid or, you know, one school, you're important in whole society because all of us affect each other. Just like in our society, in Salt Lake City, in Salt Lake Valley, in Utah, in the United States, each individual piece is very small. And the same thing in the forest, the tropical rainforest, these magnificent, diverse, amazing habitats. These little canopy plants, they have an important role to play too. And I just love thinking about that, of how the small interacts with the large and how important all of it is. Usually animals in the canopy just do their own thing and we do our own thing up in the canopy. But there was this one interaction just 2 years ago, and I actually was bringing up a young woman who had never been in the canopy before. She was really scared, and I said, there's nothing to worry about. You know, these canopy techniques are really safe, and none of the animals are going to bother us. Don't worry. You know, there are no snakes in the canopy. Well, there are a few snakes, but they're not poisonous, so don't worry about it. So we went up in the canopy, and suddenly we saw this group of spider monkeys that were far off in the distance and went, oh, that's cool, spider monkeys. And we saw the two males just like interacting and fighting with each other on different branches. And they started coming closer. And we were like, oh, that's interesting. We're going to get a real good look at them. And then they got closer. And suddenly we realized they were coming for our tree. And they came right into our fig tree. And the three of us, it was me and my field assistant and this young woman, were standing up in the tree thinking, oh my God, they're coming. And so these monkeys started circling us. And they were as far away as from me to you. They were like 7 feet away. And I got scared because these guys are big. And so I reached in my pocket for my pocket knife. And I took out the blade and I was like ready to get them in case they attacked me. But of course, they did not attack us. They just wanted to see what the heck we were doing up there. Because even though we're primates, you know, we're not monkeys. And so I think they were just curious, like, who are these things? And so after a while, after circling us for a few minutes, they just sort of went off to another tree in another part of the forest and it was over. But the three of us just looked at each other and went like, oh my gosh, that was exciting.